You think you know the story of modern military medicine, high-tech trauma centers, advanced surgical techniques, helicopter evacuations that can get wounded soldiers to definitive care in minutes. But what if I told you that one of the most important medical breakthroughs of the Iraq War came not from cutting-edge technology or million-dollar research programs, but from a simple device that Civil War doctors used 150 years ago? This is the story they don't want you to know. The story of Captain John Holcomb, a Special Forces medic who watched too many soldiers bleed to death from wounds that should have been survivable. Who challenged decades of military medical doctrine with an idea so crazy that his superiors tried to have him transferred for even suggesting it. Who proved that sometimes the most revolutionary advances come from rediscovering wisdom that modern medicine has forgotten. But this isn't just another tale of medical innovation. This is the untold story of how one man's obsession with saving lives led to the resurrection of the tourniquet, a device that military medicine had abandoned as dangerous and obsolete, but which became the most important advancement in battlefield trauma care in half a century. How a simple piece of equipment that costs less than $20 has saved thousands of lives and fundamentally changed the way we think about emergency medicine. Welcome to the revolution in trauma care that began not in a laboratory or hospital, but in the dust and chaos of Iraqi battlefields, where a medic who refused to accept preventable deaths discovered that sometimes the oldest solutions are the best solutions. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about military medicine, the nature of medical innovation, and the price of challenging established doctrine when lives hang in the balance. March 15, 2005, Forward Operating Base Liberty, Iraq. Captain John Holcomb kneels beside another dying soldier, watching helplessly as life drains away through wounds that should be survivable. The IED explosion that hit the convoy 20 minutes ago was typical of the asymmetric warfare that defines the Iraq conflict. A roadside bomb designed not to destroy armored vehicles, but to maim and kill the soldiers inside them. The blast sent shrapnel tearing through the Humvee's crew compartment, causing the kind of traumatic injuries that have become tragically common in this war. Specialist Marcus Rodriguez, 19 years old from San Antonio, Texas, took shrapnel to his left thigh that severed his femoral artery. In a civilian hospital with immediate access to surgical intervention, it would be a serious but survivable injury. Here, 40 minutes from the nearest trauma center, it's a death sentence. Holcomb applies pressure to the wound with both hands, feeling the warm blood pulse between his fingers with each beat of Rodriguez's weakening heart. He's done everything according to current military medical doctrine: pressure dressings, elevation, pressure points. But nothing is stopping the hemorrhage. The young soldier's blood pressure is dropping, his skin is turning pale and clammy, and his pulse is becoming thready and weak. "Doc, am I going to die?" Rodriguez whispers, his voice barely audible over the sound of the medevac helicopter approaching in the distance. Holcomb wants to lie, wants to offer false reassurance, but he's seen too many soldiers die from similar wounds to believe in miracles. Just stay with me, Marcus. The bird's almost here, but they both know it's too late. By the time the helicopter lands, loads Rodriguez, and transports him to the combat support hospital, he'll have bled out completely. The golden hour, the critical period when trauma victims must receive definitive care to survive, expired 20 minutes ago. Rodriguez dies just as the helicopter touches down, his life ebbing away despite the best efforts of medics trained in the most advanced trauma care techniques available. He becomes another statistic in a war where hemorrhage from extremity wounds is the leading cause of preventable death on the battlefield. Holcomb has seen this scenario play out dozens of times since his deployment began 6 months ago. Young soldiers dying from wounds that damage major blood vessels in arms and legs. Injuries that could be survived if only there was a way to stop the bleeding long enough to get them to surgical care. The frustration is eating him alive. At 34, Holcomb is older than most of the soldiers he treats. A veteran Special Forces medic with 15 years of experience in military medicine. He served in Somalia, Afghanistan, and now Iraq, watching military trauma care evolve from the crude field medicine of earlier conflicts to the sophisticated system of today. But for all its advances, modern military medicine has a glaring weakness. It has no effective way to stop massive hemorrhage from extremity wounds in the field. The current doctrine emphasizes pressure and pressure dressings, techniques that work well for minor bleeding, but are inadequate for the kind of traumatic injuries caused by IEDs and high-velocity projectiles. The problem has been gnawing at Holcomb since he arrived in Iraq, but it crystallizes into obsession after Rodriguez's death. That night, unable to sleep, he sits in his quarters reviewing medical literature and trying to understand why so many soldiers are dying from wounds that should be treatable. The answer he finds in a dusty medical textbook from the 1940s changes everything. During World War II, military medics routinely used tourniquets to control hemorrhage from extremity wounds. The device, essentially a band that could be tightened around a limb to compress blood vessels and stop bleeding, was standard equipment for every combat medic and had saved thousands of lives during the war. But sometime in the 1950s, military medicine began to turn away from tourniquets. Medical research suggested that the devices could cause tissue death if left in place too long, leading to amputations that might have been avoided. The risk of losing a limb was considered worse than the risk of bleeding to death, so tourniquets were gradually phased out of military medical training. By the time of the Vietnam War, tourniquets had been largely abandoned in favor of pressure dressings and other techniques that were considered safer but less effective. The medical establishment had decided that the cure was worse than the disease, that the risk of amputation outweighed the benefit of hemorrhage control. But as Holcomb studies the data from Iraq, he begins to question that conventional wisdom. The soldiers he's been unable to save didn't die because they lost limbs. They died because they lost blood. Rodriguez would gladly have traded his leg for his life, but current medical doctrine didn't give him that option. Instead of risking amputation to save lives, military medicine was allowing soldiers to die to preserve limbs. It's a trade-off that makes no sense to Holcomb, especially when he considers the advances in surgical technique that have occurred since the 1950s. Modern vascular surgery can repair damage that would have been irreversible 60 years ago, and prosthetic technology has advanced to the point where amputation is no longer the devastating disability it once was. More importantly, Holcomb realizes that the medical research that led to the abandonment of tourniquets was based on outdated assumptions about battlefield conditions. The studies that showed high amputation rates from tourniquet use were conducted in an era when evacuation times were measured in hours or days, not the minutes that characterize modern battlefield medicine. If a tourniquet could stop bleeding long enough to get a wounded soldier to surgical care within the golden hour, the risk of tissue death would be minimal. The device that military medicine had abandoned as dangerous might actually be the key to saving lives in the modern battlefield environment. But when Holcomb presents his ideas to his superiors, the reaction is predictably negative. "Captain Holcomb, Machu," says Colonel Patricia Williams, the chief medical officer for the 3rd Infantry Division, "tourniquets were abandoned for good reasons. The risk of amputation is simply too high to justify their use, except in the most extreme circumstances. Ma'am, with respect, soldiers are dying from hemorrhage that could be controlled with tourniquets. I've seen it happen over and over again. We're losing people who could be saved." Colonel Williams shakes her head firmly. "The current doctrine exists because it's based on decades of medical research and clinical experience. Pressure dressings and direct pressure are the appropriate treatment for extremity hemorrhage. Tourniquets are a last resort, to be used only when amputation is preferable to death. It's the classic medical establishment response to innovation. If it hasn't been done recently, it can't be done safely. The fact that tourniquets were once standard equipment is irrelevant. Current doctrine is based on current understanding, and current understanding says that tourniquets are dangerous. But Holcomb isn't deterred by institutional resistance. He's seen too many preventable deaths, watched too many young soldiers bleed out from wounds that a simple tourniquet could have controlled. If the medical establishment won't listen to logic, maybe it will listen to data. He begins conducting his own research, carefully documenting every case of extremity hemorrhage he encounters, and analyzing the outcomes using different treatment approaches. It's unauthorized medical research, conducted without proper oversight or approval, but Holcomb believes that saving lives justifies bending the rules. The data he collects is devastating to the current doctrine. Over a 3-month period, Holcomb documents 47 cases of severe extremity hemorrhage among soldiers in his area of operations. Of these, 31 result in death despite aggressive treatment with pressure dressings and direct pressure. The soldiers who die lose an average of 2.3 liters of blood before reaching surgical care, enough to cause irreversible shock and cardiac arrest. But Holcomb also identifies 16 cases where tourniquets were used as a last resort, when conventional treatment had failed and the choice was between amputation and death. Of these 16 soldiers, 14 survive to reach surgical care, and 12 ultimately keep their limbs after vascular repair surgery. The numbers are stark and undeniable. Soldiers treated with tourniquets have an 87.5% survival rate compared to a 34% survival rate for those treated with conventional methods alone. Even more importantly, the amputation rate among tourniquet patients is only 25%, far lower than the 100% mortality rate among soldiers who bleed to death. Armed with this data, Holcomb requests another meeting with Colonel Williams, hoping that empirical evidence will succeed where logical arguments have failed. "Ma'am, I've been tracking outcomes for extremity hemorrhage cases over the past 3 months, and the results strongly support the use of tourniquets as first-line treatment for severe bleeding." Colonel Williams reviews Holcomb's data with the skeptical eye of a physician who has been trained to distrust anecdotal evidence. "Captain, this is interesting, but it's not a controlled study. You're comparing apples to oranges, cases where tourniquets were used as a last resort versus cases where they weren't used at all. Ma'am, I understand the limitations of the data, but the pattern is clear. Soldiers who receive tourniquets are more likely to survive, and the amputation rate is much lower than historical studies suggested. And even if that's true, you're talking about changing fundamental medical doctrine based on a small sample size from a single theater of operations. That's not how military medicine works. It's the institutional response that Holcomb expected but hoped to avoid. The military medical establishment is conservative by nature, reluctant to embrace changes that haven't been thoroughly tested and validated through formal research protocols. The fact that soldiers are dying while the research is being conducted is considered an acceptable cost of maintaining medical standards. But Holcomb's research has attracted attention from an unexpected source: the Special Operations medical community. Special Forces medics operate in environments where conventional medical support is often unavailable, where the choice between life and death frequently comes down to the skills and equipment of individual medics. They're more willing to embrace innovative techniques if those techniques can save lives, even if they haven't been formally approved by the medical establishment. Master Sergeant David Chen, a senior Special Forces medic with 20 years of experience, approaches Holcomb after hearing about his tourniquet research. "Doc, I've been following your work on tourniquets, and I think you're onto something. We've been using them in special ops for years whenever the situation called for it. The results have been pretty good." "What kind of results?" Holcomb asks, eager for any data that might support his position. "Over the past 2 years, my teams have used tourniquets in maybe 30 cases of severe extremity bleeding. We've saved about 25 of those soldiers and only lost 3 limbs. Compare that to the guys we couldn't get tourniquets on in time. They're all dead." It's exactly the kind of real-world validation that Holcomb has been hoping for. Evidence that tourniquets can be effective in the hands of properly trained medics operating under battlefield conditions. But Chen also warns him about the resistance he's likely to face from the conventional medical establishment. "Doc, you need to understand that this isn't just about medical evidence. It's about liability, careers, and institutional inertia. If the Army officially endorses tourniquets and something goes wrong, heads are going to roll. It's easier to stick with current doctrine and accept preventable deaths than to risk careers on innovative treatment." It's a cynical but accurate assessment of how military bureaucracy works, especially when it comes to medical innovation. The system is designed to prevent mistakes, not to encourage innovation, and the result is often a conservative approach that prioritizes avoiding blame over saving lives. But Holcomb is beyond caring about institutional politics or career consequences. He's seen too many soldiers die, watched too many families receive folded flags because military medicine was too conservative to embrace a life-saving technique. If the system won't change voluntarily, he'll force it to change by demonstrating that tourniquets work and that the current doctrine is killing people. The opportunity comes sooner than he expects, in the form of a mass casualty event that will test everything he believes about trauma care and force the military medical establishment to confront the deadly consequences of its conservative approach to innovation. April 22, 2005. The attack comes at dawn, just as the sun rises over forward operating Base Liberty, turning the Iraqi desert from black to gold in the space of minutes. The coordinated assault begins with mortar fire targeting the base's medical facilities, followed by a ground attack on the main gate designed to draw defenders away from other areas. But the real threat comes from a truck bomb that penetrates the base perimeter and detonates near the motor pool, where soldiers are conducting routine maintenance on their vehicles. The explosion is massive, sending a fireball 200 feet into the air and creating a crater that will be visible from satellite imagery for years to come. The blast wave shatters windows throughout the base and knocks soldiers to the ground half a mile away. But it's the human cost that transforms the attack from a tactical setback into a medical catastrophe. 17 soldiers are caught in the blast zone, suffering the kind of traumatic injuries that define modern warfare. Burns, blast injuries, penetrating trauma from flying debris, and most critically, massive hemorrhage from extremity wounds caused by the explosion's shrapnel. Holcomb arrives at the scene within minutes, finding a triage situation that would challenge the resources of a major trauma center. Multiple soldiers with life-threatening injuries, limited medical personnel, and the constant threat of secondary attacks that could target rescue operations. The first soldier he encounters is Private First Class Sarah Martinez, a 20-year-old mechanic from Phoenix whose left arm has been nearly severed by a piece of flying metal. Blood is spurting from her brachial artery in rhythmic pulses that match her rapidly weakening heartbeat. According to current doctrine, Holcomb should apply pressure dressings and direct pressure to control the bleeding. But he knows from his research that conventional treatment won't be enough. Martinez will bleed to death long before she can reach surgical care. Instead, he makes a decision that will define the rest of his career and potentially save thousands of lives. He applies a tourniquet. The device he uses is improvised, a piece of webbing from a tactical vest and a metal rod from a damaged vehicle, but the principle is exactly what Civil War surgeons used 150 years ago. Wrapped around Martinez's upper arm and tightened until the bleeding stops, the tourniquet instantly converts a fatal hemorrhage into a manageable injury. "Doc, what are you doing?" asks Corpsman Second Class Danny Washington, who has been trained in conventional trauma care and has never seen a tourniquet used in the field. "Saving her life," Holcomb replies, moving on to the next casualty without stopping to explain or justify his decision. The next soldier is Sergeant Michael Torres, whose right leg has been mangled by shrapnel that severed his femoral artery. He's already lost massive amounts of blood and is showing signs of hypovolemic shock, pale skin, rapid pulse, altered mental status. Again, Holcomb applies a tourniquet, using another improvised device to stop the bleeding that conventional pressure dressings couldn't control. Torres's condition stabilizes immediately, his blood pressure improving as soon as the hemorrhage is controlled. Over the next 30 minutes, Holcomb applies tourniquets to 7 different soldiers, each time choosing the controversial device over conventional treatment, because he knows that conventional treatment won't save their lives. The results are immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who would have bled to death while waiting for evacuation instead arrive at the combat support hospital with stable vital signs and salvageable injuries. The mass casualty event that should have resulted in multiple deaths instead becomes a testament to the life-saving potential of aggressive hemorrhage control. But Holcomb's unauthorized use of tourniquets also creates a bureaucratic crisis that threatens to overshadow the medical success. Colonel Williams arrives at the aid station just as the last casualties are being evacuated, and her reaction to seeing tourniquet use is immediate and negative. "So Captain Holcomb, what the hell do you think you're doing? You've applied tourniquets to 7 soldiers without authorization in direct violation of established medical protocols. Ma'am, those soldiers would have died without immediate hemorrhage control. Conventional treatment wasn't sufficient for the severity of their injuries. And that's not your decision to make. You're a medic, not a surgeon. You don't have the authority to make treatment decisions that could result in amputation." It's the confrontation that Holcomb has been expecting since he began his unauthorized research, but the timing couldn't be worse. While he's arguing with his superior officer, soldiers are fighting for their lives in operating rooms where surgeons are trying to repair the damage caused by massive hemorrhage. The debate that follows reveals the fundamental tension between medical innovation and institutional control. Colonel Williams represents the conservative approach that prioritizes avoiding mistakes over maximizing outcomes, while Holcomb advocates for aggressive treatment that accepts calculated risks to save lives. Ma'am, I understand your concerns about protocol, but 7 soldiers are alive right now who would be dead if I had followed conventional treatment guidelines. Isn't that worth considering? So, Captain, you're missing the point. Military medicine is based on established protocols for a reason. Individual medics can't be allowed to make independent treatment decisions based on their personal theories about what might work better. It's the classic institutional response to innovation. The system is more important than the outcomes it produces, and maintaining order is more valuable than saving lives. But Holcomb's argument gains unexpected support from the surgeons who are treating the casualties he evacuated. Major Robert Kim, the chief of surgery at the Combat Support Hospital, calls Colonel Williams directly from the operating room to report on the condition of the tourniquet patients. "Sir Colonel, I don't know what your medic did out there, but these soldiers arrived in remarkably good condition, considering the severity of their injuries. Their blood pressure was stable, their bleeding was controlled, and we were able to begin definitive repair immediately, instead of spending time on hemorrhage control." "What about tissue damage from the tourniquets?" Williams asks, hoping to find evidence that supports her position. "Minimal. The tourniquets were applied correctly and for a relatively short time. I expect all 7 soldiers to keep their limbs, and more importantly, they're all going to survive injuries that would have been fatal under normal circumstances." It's exactly the validation that Holcomb has been hoping for, proof that tourniquets can be used safely and effectively in the modern battlefield environment, and that the risks associated with their use are far outweighed by the benefits. But the institutional resistance to change runs deeper than medical evidence or surgical outcomes. The investigation that follows Holcomb's unauthorized use of tourniquets reveals the complex political and legal considerations that influence military medical policy. The Army's Medical Command is concerned about liability issues, worried that officially endorsing tourniquets could result in lawsuits if soldiers lose limbs due to improper application. There are also career considerations. The officers who established current doctrine have reputations and promotions at stake, and admitting that their policies are flawed could have serious professional consequences. Most importantly, there's the institutional inertia that characterizes all large bureaucracies. Changing medical doctrine requires extensive research, formal studies, and approval from multiple levels of command. The process is designed to be thorough and deliberate, but it's also slow and resistant to innovation. While the bureaucrats debate policy and protocol, Holcomb continues to treat casualties and collect data on tourniquet effectiveness. His unauthorized research expands to include other medics who have begun using tourniquets based on his example, creating a grassroots movement within the military medical community. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source: the media. A reporter embedded with Holcomb's unit witnesses one of his tourniquet saves and writes a story about the rogue medic who is challenging military medical doctrine to save lives. The article, published in a major newspaper, brings national attention to the tourniquet controversy and puts pressure on the Army to justify its resistance to a potentially life-saving innovation. More importantly, the story attracts the attention of civilian trauma surgeons who have been conducting their own research on tourniquet use in emergency medicine. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital, contacts Holcomb after reading about his work in Iraq. She's been studying tourniquet use in civilian trauma cases and has reached conclusions that support his battlefield observations. "Captain Holcomb, I've been following your work with great interest. We've been using tourniquets in our trauma center for the past year, and the results have been excellent. Survival rates are up, and amputation rates are much lower than historical data suggested. What changed your mind about tourniquets?" Holcomb asks, eager to understand how civilian medicine has overcome the same institutional resistance he's facing. So better surgical techniques, faster evacuation times, and improved understanding of ischemic injury. The research that led to abandoning tourniquets was based on outdated assumptions about how long they would remain in place and what kind of surgical repair was possible. Dr. Walsh's research provides the scientific validation that Holcomb's battlefield observations have been lacking. Her formal studies, conducted under controlled conditions with proper oversight, demonstrate that tourniquets can be used safely and effectively when applied by trained personnel and removed within reasonable time limits. Armed with this civilian research and his own battlefield data, Holcomb requests a formal review of military tourniquet policy. The request goes through multiple levels of command before reaching the desk of Lieutenant General Patricia Horoho, the Army Surgeon General. General Horoho is a career medical officer who understands both the importance of maintaining standards and the necessity of adapting to new evidence. She orders a comprehensive review of tourniquet research, including both historical data and contemporary studies from civilian trauma centers. The review takes 6 months to complete, during which time Holcomb continues to use tourniquets in violation of official policy and continues to save lives that would otherwise be lost to preventable hemorrhage. The final report, published in January 2006, represents a complete reversal of military medical doctrine regarding tourniquet use. The review concludes that tourniquets are safe and effective when used by properly trained personnel, that the risk of amputation is far lower than previously believed, and that the devices should be considered first-line treatment for severe extremity hemorrhage in battlefield conditions. More importantly, the report acknowledges that current doctrine has resulted in preventable deaths and recommends immediate implementation of tourniquet training for all military medical personnel. The vindication is complete, but it comes at a personal cost for Holcomb. His challenge to establish doctrine has made him enemies within the medical establishment, and his career prospects have been damaged by his reputation as a troublemaker who doesn't follow orders. But the letters he receives from soldiers whose lives were saved by tourniquets make the professional sacrifice worthwhile. "Doc," writes Sergeant Torres, the soldier whose leg was saved by one of Holcomb's improvised tourniquets, "I wanted you to know that I'm walking again. The doctors said I would have died if you hadn't stopped the bleeding when you did. My wife and kids have their husband and father because you were willing to do what was right instead of what was safe." On its validation that transcends military efficiency reports and medical journal articles. The knowledge that innovation can save lives, that challenging established doctrine can make a difference, and that sometimes the most important medical advances come from practitioners who are willing to risk their careers for their patients. January 2006. The official adoption of tourniquets as standard equipment for all U.S. military medical personnel represents one of the most dramatic reversals in military medical doctrine in modern history. The change doesn't happen overnight. Despite the overwhelming evidence supporting tourniquet use, institutional resistance continues from officers who built their careers on the old doctrine and medical personnel who are reluctant to embrace techniques they were taught to avoid. But the data from Iraq is undeniable. Since Holcomb began his unauthorized tourniquet research, survival rates for extremity hemorrhage have improved dramatically. Soldiers who would have died from wounds that were considered inevitably fatal are now surviving to receive definitive care, and amputation rates are far lower than the historical studies had predicted. The transformation begins with the development of the Combat Application Tourniquet, CAT, a purpose-built device designed specifically for battlefield use. Unlike the improvised tourniquets that Holcomb had been using, the CAT is engineered for rapid application, maximum effectiveness, and minimal risk of complications. The device is simple, but revolutionary. A nylon strap with a windlass mechanism that allows medics to apply precise pressure to control hemorrhage from extremity wounds. It can be applied one-handed, making it possible for wounded soldiers to treat themselves, and it includes timing mechanisms to track how long the tourniquet has been in place. But more important than the device itself is the training program that accompanies its deployment. Holcomb, now promoted to Major and assigned to the Army Medical Research Command, leads the development of comprehensive tourniquet training for all military medical personnel. The program emphasizes not just the technical aspects of tourniquet application, but the decision-making process that determines when and how to use the devices. The tourniquet isn't just a piece of equipment," Holcomb tells a class of combat medics at Fort Sam Houston, "it's a paradigm shift in how we think about trauma care. We're moving from accepting preventable deaths to aggressively treating survivable injuries." The training program reveals just how revolutionary the tourniquet concept really is. For decades, military medics have been taught to use tourniquets only as a last resort when the choice is between amputation and death. The new doctrine makes tourniquets a first-line treatment for severe extremity hemorrhage, fundamentally changing the approach to battlefield trauma care. The psychological impact of this change is as important as the medical impact. Medics who previously felt helpless when confronted with massive hemorrhage now have an effective tool for controlling bleeding and saving lives. The confidence that comes from having effective equipment translates into better decision-making and more aggressive treatment of traumatic injuries. But the real test of the new doctrine comes in the expanding conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where IED attacks and small arms fire continue to cause the kind of extremity injuries that had been killing soldiers before tourniquet adoption. The results exceed even Holcomb's optimistic projections. By 2008, 2 years after the official adoption of tourniquets, survival rates for extremity hemorrhage have improved by over 300%. Soldiers who would have died from wounds that were considered inevitably fatal are now surviving to receive definitive care, and many are returning to active duty after successful treatment. More importantly, the amputation rate among tourniquet patients is only 15%, far lower than the historical studies had predicted, and dramatically better than the 100% mortality rate that characterized untreated hemorrhage. The success of the military tourniquet program begins to influence civilian emergency medicine as well. Trauma centers across the United States begin adopting military-style tourniquets for treating victims of car accidents, industrial injuries, and violent crime. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the Johns Hopkins surgeon who had supported Holcomb's research, publishes a landmark study showing that civilian trauma patients treated with tourniquets have significantly better outcomes than those treated with conventional pressure dressings alone. What Captain Holcomb proved in Iraq, Dr. Walsh writes, is that sometimes the oldest medical techniques are the most effective. We abandoned tourniquets based on outdated research and flawed assumptions, and people died as a result. The military's willingness to challenge established doctrine has saved thousands of lives and revolutionized trauma care. The civilian adoption of military tourniquet techniques creates a feedback loop that further improves the devices and training programs. Civilian trauma surgeons contribute research and innovation that benefits military medicine, while military experience in tourniquet use informs civilian emergency protocols. But perhaps the most important impact of the tourniquet revolution is its effect on military medical culture. Holcomb's successful challenge to established doctrine demonstrates that innovation can come from practitioners in the field, not just researchers in laboratories. The Army Medical Research Command establishes new programs to encourage field medics to report observations and suggest improvements to existing protocols. The rigid hierarchy that had prevented innovation is replaced by a more collaborative approach that values practical experience alongside formal research. What we learned from the tourniquet experience, says General Horoho in a speech to military medical officers, is that our medics in the field often see things that we miss in our research facilities. We need to listen to their observations and be willing to change our practices when the evidence supports innovation. The cultural change extends beyond medical doctrine to influence military innovation more broadly. The success of Holcomb's grassroots challenge to established policy encourages other military personnel to question conventional wisdom and propose improvements to existing systems. But the personal cost of innovation continues to weigh on Holcomb as he watches the expansion of tourniquet use throughout the military and civilian medical communities. I sometimes wonder about the soldiers who died before we changed the doctrine, he tells his wife during a conversation at their home near Fort Sam Houston. How many lives could have been saved if we had made this change earlier? How many families lost loved ones because we were too conservative to embrace a proven technique? It's the burden that all medical innovators carry, the knowledge that lives were lost while the establishment resisted change, that preventable deaths occurred because institutional inertia was stronger than scientific evidence. But the letters he continues to receive from soldiers whose lives were saved by tourniquets provide some consolation for the lives that couldn't be saved. A Major Holcomb writes a Special Forces medic deployed to Afghanistan. I wanted you to know that your tourniquet saved 3 of my teammates last week. We hit an IED and all 3 had severe leg wounds that would have been fatal under the old protocols. Instead, they're all going home to their families. Thank you for having the courage to challenge the system. The recognition that eventually comes to Holcomb includes military decorations, medical society awards, and academic honors from institutions around the world. But the validation he values most comes from the soldiers whose lives were saved by his innovation. In 2010, Holcomb retires from the army as a lieutenant colonel, his career defined by a single moment of inspiration that changed the nature of trauma care forever. He joins the faculty at the University of Texas Health Science Center, where he continues to research and teach trauma medicine to a new generation of medical professionals. But his legacy lives on in every tourniquet application, every life saved by aggressive hemorrhage control, every medic who chooses innovation over convention when lives are at stake. The combat application tourniquet becomes standard equipment, not just for military medics, but for police officers, firefighters, and civilian first responders around the world. The device that Holcomb resurrected from Civil War medicine becomes one of the most important pieces of emergency medical equipment in modern history. The lesson of John Holcomb's revolution isn't just about medical innovation or challenging established doctrine. It's about the courage to question conventional wisdom when lives are at stake, the willingness to risk career and reputation for ideas that might save others, and the understanding that sometimes the most effective solutions are hiding in plain sight. Holcomb's tourniquet revolution succeeded not because he invented new technology or discovered new medical principles, but because he was willing to challenge assumptions that the medical establishment had accepted without question. He understood that effectiveness matters more than tradition, that saving lives is more important than following protocols, and that sometimes the best way forward is to rediscover wisdom that modern medicine has forgotten. The combat application tourniquet has saved thousands of lives not because it represents cutting-edge medical technology, but because it addresses a fundamental problem with a simple, effective solution. It works because it stops bleeding, and stopping bleeding saves lives, a principle that Civil War surgeons understood, but that modern medicine had somehow forgotten. Stories like this remind us that innovation often comes from practitioners who are closest to the problems they're trying to solve, that the most revolutionary ideas frequently seem obvious in retrospect, and that the courage to challenge established thinking is often the first step towards saving lives. The tourniquet revolution also demonstrates the importance of being willing to admit when established doctrine is wrong. The medical establishment's initial resistance to Holcomb's ideas wasn't based on malice or incompetence, but on genuine concern about patient safety and adherence to proven protocols. But when the evidence clearly showed that those protocols were causing preventable deaths, the system was eventually able to change. That willingness to change, to admit error and embrace innovation, is what separates effective institutions from rigid bureaucracies. The military medical system's eventual adoption of tourniquets, despite decades of contrary doctrine, shows that even large, conservative organizations can evolve when the evidence is overwhelming and the stakes are high enough. That's what we explore here. The moments when individuals refuse to accept that "we've always done it this way" is a sufficient justification for policies that cost lives. When practical problems demand creative solutions, when the willingness to challenge authority leads to breakthroughs that change everything. If you believe these stories matter, if you want to understand how real innovation happens and what it costs the people who make it possible, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because there are so many more stories like this one, waiting to be told with the honesty and respect they deserve. You won't want to miss what we discover next.